Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Today I want to dive into root cause analysis, but from a different perspective, chain of custody. If you are not familiar with the term chain of custody, don't let it be a surprise, right? This is something that I learned along the way. And I'll kind of share that story in a minute, but chain of custody is typically a legal term. And what it means in a legal context is basically a chronological record of the custody or control, transfer, analysis, and disposition of materials, right? Pretty fancy. So let me talk a little bit about the story in terms of how I came to understand chain of custody, how I was able to recognize the importance of it, and then I'll share a story about how we can actually utilize chain of custody in terms of thought process to help us solve problems, and kind of specifically solve intermittent problems, which tend to be a really challenging problem to solve. So, and I've got a story for that as well, one here recently that we worked on. So, how did I learn about chain of custody? So years ago, I was responsible for a facility that produced, we manufactured, this was a custom manufacturing environment, and we manufactured chain of custody documents. So what's a chain of custody document, right? If you think about, for anybody out there that maybe has gone to take a urinalysis test, a drug screen, anything like that, back in the day, and it's been a minute since I've gone to take one of these, so I don't know if they're still doing this, right? But back in the day, what you would have is a physical form, generally a multi-part, that would get filled out with all of your information, probably all the company information, that type of thing. It would have, the lab company that was going to be performing the testing on there as well. Then there would be a series of labels that would coincide with the form itself. So the reason that these became chain of custody is because what would happen is that there was a series of control numbers that would be that would link all of the labels that would be applied to, let's say, the vial or your records or those types of things and this document. So those are the things that would tie all of the touch points, if you will, back to the results of your test, right? So that's how I learned about chain of custody. We were producing chain of custody documents. You could think about, from a transportation perspective, you could think about bills of ladings, if you're familiar with that at all, or just even on maybe, your Amazon packages, seeing the UPS tracking number. Those are all kind of forms of chain of custody, because what they're really doing, again, is allowing you to understand and record all of the different touches, transfers, control of material, right? Could be a urinalysis test and your actual specimen or sample. Could be an Amazon package, something that you ordered for around the house, right? So that's the kind of background. That's how I came up learning about chain of custody. And, there's all kinds of specific applications with this, especially when you start to get into, the legal stuff. But let's kind of shift gears now into how do we apply the thought process of chain of custody to something like root cause. And there's a pretty good chance that if you've ever heard root cause analysis or tried to solve some problems, you've probably also heard of the 5 whys method, right? Really popular methodology to get to the root cause of an issue. Could use a fishbone diagram, right? There's all these tools available. Those are a couple of the more popular ones. So the reason I like this idea around chain of custody is because oftentimes we have intermittent problems, right? So things that, are a problem then kind of seemingly disappear without a trace. And then, some time goes by. So we think we've solved that problem, if we've done root cause analysis or not. But, we're not seeing the issue anymore. So we believe that we've solved the problem somehow, some way. And lo and behold, a month goes by or 6 months goes by, and then this problem resurfaces, right? So that's what I mean by a intermittent type of problem. And here recently, there was a company this was a custom manufacturing business that was struggling with one of these intermittent types of problems. And, they had a lot of really bright people that were doing a lot of really amazing work, and they had gone through and done a lot of root cause analysis. They were looking at a lot of data that they had collected over the course of time. And, kind of long story short, they hadn't been able to solve this issue. They recognized it as an intermittent issue because, they would do a whole bunch of root cause analysis, they would do a bunch of testing, and then the problem would disappear. And so they could no longer continue the investigation because the problem went away. And it was like they're kind of left saying like, we must have solved it with all of these different, tests and things we were looking at and, trials of things. And some time would pass, sometimes it was 3 months, sometimes it was 6 months. I think the longest they shared in between instances was like 9 or 12 months, something like that, right? So this very inconsistent issue that they continued to see. And, on the surface, they had done all of the things possible to try to figure out like what the heck is going on, right? As I said, lots of bright minds, lots of, folks that were adept at the kind of traditional tool set that you would utilize to solve one of these problems. And so this is how I connected the dots in terms of, the things I've learned from a chain of custody perspective. And here's what you can do in your business with the problems you see on a day-to-day basis. And it goes a little bit deeper than just trying to apply a tool like a 5 Whys, where you can, again, then layer that tool in. So this for me is always the starting point, right? Like this concept around chain of custody and understanding kind of all of the different touch points. What are all of the critical process flows? What are all of the key parts of, in this case, it was a manufacturing process, right? But you could certainly apply this in a service type setting as well, right? Like what are all the key touch points? What are the inputs? What are the anticipated outputs, right? All of these different things. So when we think about chain of custody and like, again, how do we tie that thought process together? It kind of comes down to really five key steps, right? That's what I've kind of simplified this down for. So obviously step number one is we have to not just understand, right? But understand at a really deep level, what are all of these key steps? Okay. So in the example I gave, this intermittent quality issue that this custom manufacturing company was seeing, that meant for us that we needed to do an end-to-end process flow diagram of their entire supply chain, right? So tier one and tier two suppliers, right? In this case, that's where it stopped, but tier one, tier two suppliers, all the way through finished goods and delivery, right? To understand what are all of the variables that we're looking at, right? What are the workflow processes? What are the pieces of equipment? Who's involved, right? Then once you've got that, kind of visual picture of what all of those touch points are, right? Then you can get to kind of step number two and start to ask yourself like, what are the controls? How are we collecting data? What access to information do we have Are we already collecting something? Do we maybe need to go and collect something, right? So step number one becomes a really powerful tool to unpack. Boy, do we even have any visibility over this thing, that we may or, may not need visibility over, right? So again, using this as one key example, we look at and say, okay, well, we purchased some products, right? We purchased some raw materials from a vendor. What kind of controls do they have in place? How do we ensure that we are getting consistent delivery of those materials that we expect? Do we do any testing of those materials when it comes inbound to us, right? Before we even start the manufacturing process. So it's literally that type of granularity that we're looking for to be able to understand, again, not just what are the critical touch points, but what's the data involved? What's the, again, what's the input? What's the output? What's the expectations? And do we have a way to, fully understand that through process and data? So you might find yourself that we've mapped this, entire supply chain, right, or entire service model for this specific business or service delivery component. And we've actually identified a scenario where we need to collect some more data, right? So again, in a situation like this, I'm thinking chain of custody. I'm thinking, how do we, get to a point where we're able to unpack ultimately what the root cause is? Oftentimes, right, when we're in this scenario, the simplest pathway is just to do some manual data collection, right? We're looking for a snapshot that may give us a clue or point us in a specific direction for some additional, research, right? For some additional deep dive data collection. So, always start simple, right? Like that's kind of asterisk side note. Don't get yourself in the weeds of like, we, really need visibility over this particular process, because what you may find is that, this is a temporary need. We can do something manual. We can collect that information, aggregate it, analyze it, and, move on our way, right? It's helped to tell the story of this isn't an issue. Status quo is cool, right? So it kind of works me already into, step three, which is around a gap analysis of just, again, understanding where do the variations live? That's the real question of the gap analysis in this scenario of the chain of custody root cause scenario, right? Like, what's anticipated and what kind of variances are we seeing, right? Do we have a way to measure those variances? How far outside of, the intended tolerances have we gotten? So once you've kind of started to do that, right, we're really working ourselves into being able to key in and target some potentials. Now is where you can start to utilize a tool like the 5 Whys, fishbone diagram. That's kind of where I like to deploy it, is when you're in this gap analysis, really, really unpacking deep in the weeds. You've got data, you've got all of the key touch points. You're starting to have these conversations, bringing cross-functional folks together, maybe depending on, what the specifics are, but maybe you're bringing in some of your supply chain partners, your vendors, your those types of folks to be in a part of this fact-finding mission and conversation set, right? So that's where you can start to deploy that. Now, kind of coming out on the other end, after you've identified, after you've kind of really keyed in, after you've done some, some testing and kind of, to make sure that you've actually landed on what the potential root cause is, right? Like I've talked about this before, but I'll just share it before I get into these last two steps. Again, is all about to understand, did we actually get it, right? We have to introduce failure, right? We actually have to test to ensure that we did actually nail what the root cause was, right? So then after we've done all of that, now we can get into, step 4 and 5. Step 4 being kind of standardization, right? Now is when we can optimize that particular process. We can, implement any additional or kind of ancillary controls that we may need from a visibility or data visibility perspective. So what? we can monitor, okay? We got to monitor and make sure that if anything, any of those variances, fall outside of the tolerance of this, newly defined process, now we're gonna be able to understand and correlate, actual output, right? So we can move from that reactivity to a proactive, monitoring, perspective. Okay. The last thing being, again, kind of the continuous improvement loop of that, which is really just, monitoring, adjusting, understanding if, in this particular case, where there was an issue in their actual supply chain, from a supplier perspective, right? Understanding that now allowed the flexibility to say, how can we mitigate this, not just for today, but well into the future? Do we need to identify some new partners? We now understand what the real problem is, so we can be proactive in nature when we're trying to identify some new partners, to help us out with this particular thing, right? So that's the real power of taking a look at something like a intermittent problem, through the lens of chain of custody, right? I've found it's a really simple kind of starting point that is a little bit more pointed, a little bit kind of directional in terms of just sitting a team down and saying, hey, let's kind of work through these tools, whether those tools be, fishbone diagram, a 5 whys, something like that, right? I really like starting in this place of kind of, bringing folks together that are cross-functional, really, documenting and kind of understanding all of those critical touch points, because, in my experience, I've found that, not only does it get everybody talking about things in a similar fashion, but it often kind of helps to uncover, other maybe not as critical issues, but still fall in the realm of, this is probably something we need to prioritize. So it's kind of a tool that really does double duty, in terms of, this thought process for solving problems. So if you enjoyed this episode, I would encourage you to take a look at our weekly newsletter. Each one of the solo episodes is an extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. So I'll put the link to all of that stuff in the show notes. You can certainly find us online as well. And thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.